Welcome back, everybody. Left Reckoning. David here, as always, joined by Matt Leck.
Howdy, everyone.
Well, we're very honored to be joined today by our good friend and one of Michael's very good friends as well, Brian Mier. You know Brian Mier from TeleSur English and also from the very excellent Brasil Wire. How's it going, Brian?
Hey guys, it's good to be back.
Well, we got a lot to get to, man. This is sort of our introduction for our listeners about this really huge election between Lula and Bolsonaro that's coming up. Before we get into some of the details and stuff, could you just really, really briefly just set up for a particular American audience, like how the election system works for the presidential level in Brazil?
Okay, well, Brazil has 23 political parties represented in Congress. Each party gets a fund to spend on the elections based on their representation. If they don't have any representation in Congress, there's more parties. They get a tiny amount, a couple $100,000, party fund. Corporate funding is still illegal. They've tried to flexibilize it a little bit. All registered candidates for president get free commercial airtime for the 6 weeks of the official election season. The election season is much shorter. I think it would be great if they did it that way in the US, frankly. And everyone gets free airtime. So it kind of minimizes the differences in wealth between candidates. But that airtime is based on the representation in Congress. So all of the parties from coalitions, so they can take advantage of their different parties' airtime. It's complicated to explain this all in a short amount of time because it's a very different system. So starting tomorrow, the first official day of election season, at 3 times a day, there's going to be a block of political campaign commercials mandatorily run on all television stations and radio stations in the country at certain time periods. And according to the way the coalitions are mapped out, the largest coalition is going to get like 2 minutes and 45 seconds of airtime. Lula's coalition is going to get like 2 minutes and 4 seconds. The tiny Brazilian Communist Party is going to get like 7 seconds. And it just works. It works like that. But because of social media, these commercials are becoming less and less relevant or important. I think Bolsonaro himself is only going to have about 45 seconds, but he won last time with with like 20 seconds of commercial time. Then there's mandatory debates, that have to be broadcast on all the channels at the same time, except that Bolsonaro is saying he's not going to go to them because he can't speak properly, can't string together 3 sentences. That's basically how it works. So it's starting tomorrow. Tomorrow's the first time the candidates can say, I'm officially running. Before, they've had pre-campaign season before this for about 3 months, in which candidates could say, well, my coalition is running. Our coalition is running. If they decide to nominate me as their candidate as president, I'll do this and this and this. It's really just rhetoric. But it's interesting. I mean, in other words, I think there's some pretty interesting regulations around campaigning that I think the U.S. could really benefit from. Like, one thing that's really good is they don't have unbridled, corporate campaign contributions. Although there's theme-based ads, there's think tanks, there's ways around it. There's buying up, bots for bombarding people on social media, chat groups and stuff like that, chat applications. There's ways around it, but it's not as easy as the U.S.
And as for the actual election, there's a first round where if you get over 50%, that's like late October.
If you get over 50%. 3rd, October 2nd. So that's the way, because there's multiple candidates, right? I think there's about one candidate just dropped out. I think there's 6 or 7 candidates. So basically, it's not 50%. If one candidate has more votes than the sum of all other candidates, then he wins or she wins in the first round. So the way it's looking with the polls right now, if Lula could hit 46%, he would take it in the first round. And some polls are showing him pretty close to that number. But things can change fast. So if it goes to the second round, then it's just the first and the second place candidates facing off against each other.
Well, I mean, let's get into, before we start getting like too much in the campaign. I was hoping if you could sort of paint a picture for people about what the economic system situation is like in Brazil right now, particularly for working people. It's been interesting, reading up on it over the past couple of weeks. Particularly in outlets like the FT, that there's a similar kind of game that's going on with the way that people are trying to portray the economic system, where there's, all this pointing towards like job numbers, but the problem is that a lot of those kind of gains are being completely eaten up by the high cost of living and inflation that people are going through. But if you could give people a general sense as to what the conditions are like in Brazil for working people, one, going into this election, and generally after a few years of Bolsonaro, a country run by Bolsonaro.
Okay, well, basically, Bolsonaro economically represents complete continuation of the economic policies of his predecessor, the coup, President Michel Temer. According to this plan that they set up in 2014 called Bridge to the Future, which looks as if it was actually drafted in Washington. It looked like a document that had been Google translated from English when it was first presented. And it's just like a laundry list of deep neoliberal austerity cuts and privatizations. So for example, they put a spending cap on health and education, which completely screwed Brazil up during the pandemic. They privatized a lot of key sectors of industry, and then shortly after taking office, 2017, they transformed Brazil into a right-to-work nation. They completely dismantled the entire labor union system, and they flexibilized the labor force. They basically put labor law back like 80 years. They flexibilized the labor force so that you don't have all the benefits that you used to have before Dilma Rousseff was thrown out, like mandatory 13th check, mandatory severance package, 1 month paid vacation, all of that stuff. So now a large part of the workforce are like temps. They made it so that you could be like a temp indefinitely. And also, they've created this stuff to facilitate the gig economy, where there's no more 40. The work week was 44 hours in Brazil, but that was thrown out with flexibilization. So now, like Uber's made a policy in Brazil where Uber drivers can only work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. But many of them just go to other apps after the 12 hours. So, and because of other things related to because of implosion in consumer spending power caused by all of this weakening of the labor force and unemployment that's gone, it's almost at record levels right now. The unemployment situation is really bad. This has created a chain effect where a lot of factories have shut down. Brazil's been in decline industrially since the 80s, really, but they did all these measures to slow down the decline during the Lula Dilma years, which they abandoned now. And so now, Ford Motor Company, which set up in Brazil in the 1920s, has left Brazil after 100 years almost. Fiat shutting down, Mercedes shut down its plants. There's all kinds of, I could go on and on about this. I know you're economists, but I also know we don't have that much time. But in general, the end result, I'll just say this. Hunger has returned to Brazil. 45 million people are experiencing food insecurity. 20 million people are not getting 3 meals a day. 20 million children are no longer eating 3 meals a day. And that's homelessness has doubled and tripled in a lot of big cities.
Is Lula's popularity for now, is it just sort of people remembering the good times, sort of in the face of all that you're talking about there?
Well, in a way, it's kind of like remembering the good times, but it's also remembering why there were good times and what needs to be done to return it to good times. Yearly above inflation minimum salary increases, which halted when Dilma Rousseff was removed from office. Everyone remembers that. They remember how much when he took office, the minimum salary was like $49 a month in U.S. terms, and according to the dollar, when he left office, it was like $315 a month. So even though the currency Brazilian currency still was significant minimum wage increases, and that was cited as the main reason for poverty reduction. And also, people are worried that if Bolsonaro is reelected, he's going to end the affirmative action program in the universities, which sets aside 52% of university entrance positions, student positions for kids from the working class who went to public grammar school, high school, with a small differential for Afro-Brazilians. So now when Lula took office, 2% of the students in federal universities were Afro-Brazilian, and now they're at 56%. So, and people, Bolsonaro's been showing signs that Brazil is a majority Afro-Brazilian, majority black country, right? So, and Bolsonaro's been trying to usurp this. He's been trying to eat away at this. He's defunded all the public universities, which are all free. He's attempted on several occasions to start charging for tuition. So the students know this, young people know this. So it's not just like nostalgia for a time when world economic forces were better off or something. It's like people remember the concrete things.
Mm-hmm. I think we'll talk a little bit more about like specific policies in a second, but I did want to note that I think it was last month that the Bolsonaro government increased their welfare payments by 50%. But it's notable, one, that will expire at the end of the year. And two, I have a quote here from Paulo Pimenta, who's a congressman for the Workers' Party, who said on Twitter, the increase is nothing more than a popsicle that melts in the heat of unbridled inflation. Could you talk a little bit about this increase in workers' payment, in welfare payments, what you sort of make of it? And two, I'm just curious what the general sense is like how the Workers' Party is sort of reacting to that, because it just makes me think of something that happened here in Texas. And I don't think the Workers' Party is anything like the Democratic Party. But something happened here in Texas where some working class voters who almost always vote for the Democrat voted for Trump because of the $1,200 stimulus payment. And all that you got from Democrats was sort of finger wagging about it instead of sort of embracing it and say, no, we want to do much, much more. But I'd be curious how the PT and Lula in particular have reacted to this increase.
Well, Bolsonaro changed the Constitution to enable raising these are emergency COVID welfare payments, enabling him to increase them during during a pre-election season, right? Like that's supposed to be illegal because historically it's been interpreted as vote buying, right? And he also, like, in the same measure, he reduced the tax on gasoline prices. So he was able to drop gas prices by 15%. Like this week it happened. It started happening right before the elections. The Workers' Party, which always votes in a block, there's no, what's in Christian Cinema or whatever her name is, people like that, Joe Lieberman types. If you try to Joe Lieberman out the Workers' Party, you're kicked out of the party. You can't constantly vote against your party.
Mm-hmm.
You might get one chance and then you're gone. So they voted in a block to support the raise because the justification is people are going hungry. They need food. Mm-hmm. And some radical left kind of like Trotskyist splinter groups were attacking the PT for doing that. And they were just like, no, come on. What we'll do is we'll guarantee that this is going to continue after the elections. Mm-hmm. But you should take the money and vote for whoever you want to vote for. It's your right. But one more thing Bolsonaro did, he legalized predatory lending against this 3 months of payments so that the people can get it all at once with like 30% interest, 10% monthly interest. So
hey, got to do a deal.
Yeah, he's learning a lot from that guy.
Yeah, his economics minister's former hedge fund, BTG Pactual, that gives the loans out.
Oh Lord! I mean, there's like so much to get to about the gangster government that he's running. I'd be curious if there's anything that you sort of want to note to the audience, and two, I mean, we have to talk about one of the things I think on international press, and rightfully so, has gotten people worried, are these like pretty significant threats that Bolsonaro has been making against the electoral system in Brazil. He said basically he has three options. for leaving the presidency. He will either go out arrested, dead, or with victory. I mean, what's the sense here about the seriousness of Bolsonaro's claims? What's the threat level, and what's sort of being done in opposition to his threats against democracy there?
Well, people are taking it very seriously. This is going to be the hardest election since the return to democracy. There's always chaos and crazy things in Brazil elections. In 1989, they kidnapped a very wealthy businessman named Álvaro Diniz, and they captured the kidnappers and forced them to put on PT and Lula T-shirts before the press conference, and beat them until they agreed to lie that they did it to help Lula. And then that came out as being a farce like a year after the election. So there's always crazy stuff going on. Not just, where's this siren coming from?
Oh, sorry.
This is a soundtrack to what I'm saying about alarm elections. Okay. So, for the last year, not just Lula, not just Bolsonaro, but, some of his top generals are saying we're just, they've been preemptively saying that the electronic voter system is flawed. We want to be able to, the military should be able to take over the control of the vote tallying, as if they had any commitment to democracy, since they outlawed it from 1964 to 1985, basically, when they had a dictatorship. There's violence. There've been, the treasurer for PT was assassinated at his own 50th birthday party in front of his children by a guy who was just yelling Bolsonaro, Bolsonaro. And Bolsonaro's legalized the entrance of tens of thousands of guns into the country, and they have these gun clubs that basically just serve as political organization centers for fascists. The Nazi parties, illegal neo-Nazi cells have risen by 270% since Bolsonaro took office. A lot of Afro-Brazilian politicians are getting death threats from Nazis all the time. And there were some rallies for Lula. Like one rally, they flew a drone overhead and sprayed everyone with some kind of toxic pesticide at one rally, and they blew off some, very loud M80 type fireworks at another to try and scare people. So they're trying to scare people from going out onto the streets in support of Lula. It's not working that well. And there's a chance. The one of the positive things is that it looks like the military split, because it looks like some of them are getting a little bit worried, but the core military members of Bolsonaro's government are just threatening a coup constantly, which gets us to the Biden administration making a few comments, and progressive Democrats working actually a lot harder to try and send a message to Brazil that they're going to at least partially cut off relations if they don't respect the election results. But the big danger is just Lula wins and then they don't let him take power. That's what the problem is.
I mean, and the military factor, not to be too analytical about this, but that's key in any kind of crisis situation, is if the military feels like you're the guy to back. And one of the things that I remember from very early on in the Bolsonaro presidency was that he had started to bring in a lot of military figures into government, which was something that was sort of undone or not done typically because of the history of military dictatorship.
Exactly. He's got more cabinet ministers who are military now than the last two military dictators did.
Jesus Christ, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that was in the Edge of Democracy doc, but it was striking as an American to hear people say, well, we're sick of these politicians. And you have, instead here, it's well, what do? We start a Green Party or a Ford Party. They're like, oh, just throw it to the generals and they'll kick it out. To have that sort of culture still alive is terrifying.
Well, yeah, it's a different context, but it's very similar to Trumpism in many ways. And I think in the U.S. they'd say, "Oh, turn it all over to the private sector," or something.
That's their religion.
Bullshit like that.
Or the stacked judiciary. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, but there's been significant pushback. I mean, you covered for TeleSur, I believe, these student protests, which were quite inspiring.
there's a lot of pushback, and also Lula just very cleverly has all of a sudden just convinced a large section of the elites that they shouldn't back Bolsonaro. And so it's so ridiculous. But there's this organization called the Federation of Industries of São Paulo. São Paulo is the industrial heart of Brazil, right? Historically, and they were some of the main architects behind the 2016 coup against Dilma Rousseff. One of the things they did was they put this giant inflatable duck that was yellow at all the protests, and they were like giving out free champagne in front of their headquarters. And what happened since the coup is so many factories have shut down in Sao Paulo that now the heads of industry are like, wait, hold on a second. And so Lula met with them, was like, this is how we're going to reindustrialize Brazil and the state of Sao Paulo. And even though they were like factory owners and industry owners, all of a sudden they've switched sides. Like they supported Bolsonaro. And so they just wrote this letter for the rule of law and Brazilian democracy that was read out loud in universities across the country a couple of days ago, last week, and as part of these nationwide protests. So like they've just switched sides because I don't know why, Rousseff didn't make this connection to them back then. It's like if they start privatizing everything and implementing austerity cuts, there's going to be no more consumer base to buy the products you manufacture. You guys are all going to go out of business. And so, why they were like, "Oh, really? Well, it's a new director, right? I mean, the director who was directing at the time of the coup is still super anti-Lula, but all of a sudden they're on the side of PT." Then they're a major force in Brazilian politics. And with them coming over to the side of Lula, other elites have come over, and they're saying, look, Bolsonaro is we don't like Lula, but we got to do something to maintain democracy in this country.
That's just a wild dynamic because it's like, they're not trying to do anything radical. They're just trying to keep things working. And there's an LBJ tape, Lyndon Johnson talking to some George Smathers, some Florida senator in 1960s, talking about the Goldwater race. And they're saying like, look, I need people to have money so they have money to spend at my grocery stores. Like, right. And it's like, and Goldwater just wants to slash everything. So no, people can't even spend that stuff. It's wild that it just keeps recurring. You have like the sort of sensible, and like I don't want to call Lula capitalist, but like the sensible, like let's keep the markets, like people able to like sustain themselves to the extent they have to, versus like let's just cut this stuff off right now. It's wild.
This idea that you have to cut spending during a recession, it's like the most idiotic thing in the world. Like, because rich people just hide their money. The only people who actually spend money are working class and poor, really. Proportionately speaking, right? I mean, people spend some money, but
and we have to act dumb about this, but like even economists, they have velocity of money as like a concept. Like they know that this is happening, but we have to pretend otherwise because really what we want to do is, make sure poor people are the ones carrying the brunt of everything.
Yeah, that's just absurd.
Well, I mean, talking about absurd in a different way. I don't worry, y'all. We're gonna get to Lula in a minute and talk about some of the good stuff. But I think it's worthwhile for people to get the picture, not only for watching this election as it's ongoing, but also understanding, hopefully if Lula wins, which it looks like he will, and there's not some kind of fascist coup to prevent him from taking power, what he's going to be inheriting is going to be, a very different situation, both economically and politically, than what the PT left to Bolsonaro. But I was wondering, Brian, if you could just talk a couple minutes about the Central, the kind of centrist alliance that has really gained a lot of power because of the way that they've been able to position themselves under the Bolsonaro administration.
Well, these people have never lost power, really. This is the descendants of the slave owners, the oligarchies. It's coalitions of regional power bases that in most places trace their family history back to big slave owning plantations, right? And so they were major factors in the Lula presidency. Lula tried to govern with as few of them as possible until this first scandal hit called the Mensalão scandal. And then he needed the MDB party, the PMDB.
Mm-hmm.
The PMDB was the official opposition party during the dictatorship. The official government party was called Arena, which then turned into PFL and then DEM. And now it's called Union Brazil because it merged with another right-wing party. Both of these parties together, that's like the main brunt of the Central. Okay, so Lula just brought in the official opposition party from the dictatorship into his coalition. He refused to bring the actual like government dictatorship party. It was the first time since the end of the dictatorship that that party was not part of the coalition. You know, it's part of the coalition now, and they're just very, you know, really powerful. They run, you know, they run a lot of states and cities and things like that, the old-fashioned like machine politics way. And so one of the reasons they haven't been able to impeach Bolsonaro is because he dished out billions and billions of dollars of pork to all these congressmen and women and senators from these, they call it the Centrão, but it's really like center to far right. You know, I don't know why it's called the center. But that's just part of that goalpost moving thing you see in the U.S. now, where Joe Biden's a communist.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I would like to get a little bit to this campaign, and if you're okay, we might go a couple minutes over. But I'd love to start with this video here of Lula returning to his original home, and I think we'll just play a bit of the interviews in Portuguese. If you could give people a general sense after, Brian, that would be helpful.
I'm narrating in English, but then all right, just play a second of the interview. I'll explain what it was, and you can move on to the next one.
Brazil's former President Lula is leading in all polls for this year's presidential elections. This week he started a two-day tour of Pernambuco state, on the land he was born in outside of the hill town of Garanhuns, where his cousins have restored his mother's old house.
E é muito simbólico para nós. Lula está aqui em Caeté.
She's a leader of the MST, Landless Rural Workers Movement. And she's just saying that it's symbolically important for Lula to reconnect with his roots as he's starting this presidential campaign. Her name's Rosa.
With dozens of his cousins, nieces, and nephews, Lula went to an outdoor arena and addressed a crowd of thousands who'd come out to see their hometown's most famous former resident.
A gente sabe as dificuldades que a gente enfrenta por ser nordestino. A gente sabe a dificuldade que a gente enfrenta.
He's talking about all the racism against people from the Northeast in Brazil and why it's so important that Lula represents them.
E é nessa defesa da vida, da classe trabalhadora, que nós estamos
And that he defends, defending the working class as
With
well.
tens of millions of Brazilians now facing food insecurity due to the Bolsonaro administration's disastrous neoliberal economic policies, Lula took advantage of his short time back in the land of his childhood to remind everyone of the injustice of hunger.
Ora, por que uns podem ter tudo e outros podem ter nada? Como é que uma pessoa pode comer 10 pães por dia e a outra passa 10 dias sem comer um pão? Como é que país que é o maior produtor de proteína animal do mundo, as pessoas vão no açougue pegar osso para comer, carcaça de frango, pé de frango, percoço de frango?
Former President Lula will spend Wednesday in pre-campaign events in Recife. Brian Mier, TeleSur, Garanhuns.
Okay, I just realized my mic was off when I was narrating Lula.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Okay, so what Lula was saying was, why can someone eat 10 pieces of bread in a day and someone else doesn't have any bread? Why does the country that's the world's largest exporter, in the country that's the world's largest exporter of animal protein, are people buying things like bones and chicken feet in the supermarket? Once again, using everyday language to give some interesting lessons about economics, always.
I mean, so you've been obviously watching Lula around for many, many years. Could you give us a sense of, where he's sort of focusing this campaign? I think it's very notable where, he's sort of launching and what he's centering there. But two, if you feel like there's any kind of difference or renewed energy in Lula's kind of leftist politics going into this one.
Yeah, I think he's definitely taken a turn left in terms of imperialism and stuff, but this is a kind of a compromise. This move he did of taking his historic enemy from the Centrão and putting him on the vice presidential ticket, and showing that he's big enough not to be angry at people or hold grudges is actually kind of like a master political stroke, because it's brought all these people into the coalition who wouldn't be otherwise. And remember, I don't know if you remember, but the first time he was elected, he sent a card, wrote a letter to the Brazilian people saying, look, I'm not going to be as left wing as you expect. I'm not going to default on the loans to the IMF and things like that. I'm going to focus my energies on eradicating hunger. And so he made a bunch of sacrifices, but he did actually literally eradicate hunger, and hunger was a really big problem. So I have a feeling that it's going to be a similar situation where, in order to hold together this coalition, he's going to have to he's promising to undo all the labor reforms. I bet there's some kinds of compromises made in renationalizations and labor reform undoing. I bet it's going to be not 100%, but it's still going to be very significant. And he's talking about redoing the labor laws in a way that there's more care taken to gig workers and reducing their work week to 44 hours and things like that, that weren't in the old labor code. So I have a feeling that it's not going to be a radical left government. On the other hand, he's not going to jump hook, line, and sinker in alliance with the United States on foreign policy at all. He's going to maintain Brazil and is non-aligned. And people are going to complain about him a lot, but if he's managed to take power, he's going to end up significantly reducing poverty, generating a lot of jobs, and increasing opportunities for education for poor and working class like he did last time, and also slow down and make major steps forwards, in fact, in environmental, reduction of greenhouse gas, which Brazil was the world leader in during his presidency, which a lot of people overlook as well, in greenhouse gas reduction.
I'm just curious, as to what specifically that, because I keep reading about, in like The Guardian and elsewhere, that he's making a lot of environmental pledges. But I'd be curious if you could give us any sense as to what materially he's actually talking about there.
Well, first of all, if you look back at his last presidency, what they did was they massively increased the budget for all of the regulatory agencies, which enabled them to shut down the kinds of illegal mining and logging that are out of control right now because Bolsonaro gutted all of the regulatory agencies. They also spent billions of dollars on wind and solar energy, and they transitioned. This isn't like incredible or anything, but most of Brazil's electricity comes from hydro, which is very controversial. But they started phasing out these mega hydro projects. Unfortunately, Belo Monte still went through during Dilma Rousseff presidency, but in favor of these micro hydroelectric generators that don't interrupt the full flow of rivers, which is better for the fish and environment and stuff like that. But I would imagine he would just step up on all of that, the things he had done before. If that had been continuing, Brazil would have a much higher percentage of solar. And I'll give an example, like the public housing. So at one point, the Workers' Party just said all public housing, and they built millions of units of public housing, has to be solar powered. And so all the public housing had solar panels on its roof. My mother-in-law lives in one of these houses, ownership-based public housing, right? So these big, sweeping bureaucratic decisions that you say. Another thing they did was they said that mayors, they passed a national transportation code, which said mayors have to prioritize pedestrians, bicyclists, and public transportation over the automobile. And only some cities paid attention to the law. But if he took power, they would put more pressure on mayors to obey the transportation code. Like São Paulo reduced its car fleet by 20% as a result of this.
Wow.
So these kinds of things, nothing I'm not saying he's going to just snap his fingers and Brazil's going to be all running or something, which is what some American academics think third world countries should lead the world in for some reason. Why hasn't
Don't get me started on that, Brian.
Why isn't Bolivia just, if they're so environmental, why isn't it all solar now? They're peripheral capitalist country.
No, I mean, I do think it's important for people to to not fall into that kind of trap. Um, but that's a whole other episode, frankly. The kind of expectations on the developing world um, on that. I mean, I think we got a good sense of who Bolsonaro is, both when he first ran and as president. But I know it's still early days for like the official campaigning season, and I'm sure we'll definitely get you on before the vote to sort of give people a sense of it as it's actually ongoing. But like, what's your sense on like what Bolsonaro is sort of pushing? I know it's sometimes hard to talk policy wise because it's a little bit more of this than
Yeah,
anything concrete. But if you could give us a sense as to what he's sort of running on, I'd appreciate that.
he's running on good versus evil. Really, like the PT are devil, satanic worshipping, communist. Lula's wife is a satanic worshiper because she practices candomblé, which is like Santeria. That's the Latin Latina religion. His wife, Bolsonaro's wife, exorcised the Brazilian equivalent of the White House last week. PT party, the Workers' Party, wants to force everyone to have abortions. They want to force your children to be gay. This kind of stuff. That's what he's running on. Literally, it's disgusting.
Yeah, so Newsmax.
Chicago school. It's Milton Friedman.
Yeah, I mean it's good to see the right wing is so aligned, because that's exactly what. Like, it's funny, like the satanic stuff is interesting, because I feel like America, we like to play a little bit coy and act as if like certain populations are being figurative when they say satanic, but no, some of these people actually mean like this are satanic parties.
Yeah. It's so stupid that people don't want to believe it.
Yeah, exactly.
People are thinking, but it's true.
And I mean, and this goes hand in hand with like this huge evangelical movement that's been sort of exploding in Brazil over the recent years.
Except Lula's been working hard with the evangelicals.
Good.
And then like a bunch of them, maybe 40% of them who voted for Bolsonaro last time are going to vote for Lula this time around. Because he's just using Book of Matthew,
Yeah. No, play the game. I mean, and I don't mean to be like against Haddad, who ended up losing to Bolsonaro, but I remember him when he came to New York, coming and talking with Varoufakis, and don't get me wrong, what happened there was ridiculous. The campaign was horrific. But Haddad was complaining about like the bots and the evangelical movement, and Varoufakis, who I have disagreements with, but he had a good response to him. He's like, well, we just have to beat them. Like at a certain point, you can't just be like, oh, everyone's far right evangelical now. Finding a way like Lula is doing to try to bring those people in, I think, is the solution, rather than sitting out on the sidelines and complaining.
Yeah, there's a great biography of his, which I hope comes into English, by a long friend of his who's known him for like 40 years, Fernando Moraes, who just said Lula from jail was just really pissed off at the way Haddad's campaign was trying to take the high road the whole time. That being said, though, when they first polled, when Haddad came in 1 month before the elections, when they canceled Lula's candidacy, he had to come in out of nowhere. He was polling at 9%. And so the fact that he ended up with like 45% still pretty good considering that situation. But he could have been, instead of like, oh no, that's not true. I'm not going to convert your 5-year-old to different gender with our government gender panel. Instead of saying like, no, they made up. He should have been hitting back at these people, And instead, he was just trying to take the high road the whole time, unfortunately.
Well, just in the last moment before we let you go, I mean, we've both sort of implied that we think there's a very good chance that Lula's able to win this, if not in the first round, in total. I'd just be curious if you had any kind of examples or things that you've been looking at that sort of make you feel confident. Saying that, I think I was reading in the New Statesman, or maybe it was the Guardian. Forgive me for whichever British publication it was in. One of the informal polls was that they were selling way more Lula towels than Bolsonaro towels at different like beach shops around town. But I'd be curious if you have any sense, any factors that are sort of making you feel very confident about this Lula campaign.
One thing that makes me feel more confident than normal is if you look at the history of U.S. intervention in Brazil and Brazilian elections, there's always some kind of U.S. intervention. The fact that some people in congressional cabinets, staff, who are friends with Michael Brooks, who listen to the Michael Brooks show, who remember all of the stuff Michael Brooks always said about Lula, are working behind the scenes to try and pass laws and bills saying that the U.S. is going to refuse to deal with Brazil if Bolsonaro doesn't recognize the results of the elections. That gives me some hope, And they're working, and you see some Congress people coming in who aren't even that progressive getting on board with this now, So I just think that they're not powerful enough. The progressive Democrats aren't powerful enough to push through the legislation, maybe, but if they're just doing their best to let Biden know, they're going to make a lot of noise if he recognizes a coup in Brazil this time. They're not going to be caught, with their blinders on like they were in 2016 when everyone was afraid to associate with someone who'd been publicly accused of being corrupt or something. Like this time around, there's a good 30 or 40 progressive Democrats who are paying close attention to this. And a lot of that has to do with Michael Brooks, so that I think is something that makes me feel good that we didn't have in 2016,
Interesting.
No, totally. Well, Brian, I really appreciate you so much, and appreciate you spending time with us and all of your work. And hopefully we'll have you back on before the election, and definitely have you back on afterwards so we can do a final Lula Libre cheers, baby.
Great. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks, Brian.